right, Van Jones. A lot of things being talked about in this campaign.
Yep.
But do you think it's been too much about petty stuff, light stuff, and not really about some of the critical issues and stuff?
Look, most of the stuff. Wait, you are here.
Look at me.
Look at you. Look. Most of the stuff that most people are talking about in America is not being addressed by the Republicans or the Democrats. Most Americans are talking about their mortgages being underwater. You got a third of Americans whose homes are underwater right now. Every time they write their mortgage check, they're losing money as opposed to building wealth. That's not being talked about by either party. You got the students who are graduating every spring off of a cliff with all this debt. That's not being talked about. So part of what has to begin to happen is that the ordinary people are going to have to get louder so the politicians can follow us. And that's part of, you see these protests that are being ignored outside now of both conventions. But the real issues are being raised out there, much more so than in here. A lot of stuff that's happening here is just a kabuki theater for ratings or kabuki theater for this minor group or that minor group and on all that. But the big issues are being left untalked about.
Voter ID, voter suppression.
Yep.
How huge do you think that's going to be in the election?
I think that this could be worse than Florida in 2000. You could have multiple states where the outcome of the election is determined by long lines of African Americans and Latinos being locked out of the voting booth rather than being let in. And when you have that kind of an outcome, that's not good for anybody. It's certainly not good for Democrats, but it's not good for America to have a situation where you know that the other side won by essentially cheating. And so I think the voter suppression is huge. We really need to hear more top Democrats and top Republicans speaking out for more access to the ballot box, not less. Not hearing that means you're going to sound like you're just crying foul and sour grapes later. We should be raising this as a huge issue right now.
Base voters are critically important.
Yep.
And I've argued that when it comes to the Obama campaign, they have a problem in dealing with those young voters, those African Americans, Latinos.
Yep.
I think I've always said it goes beyond simply, he's worse, that he's going to be worse for you. You still need to speak to those people who are disaffected and touch them on the issues they care about.
Yeah. Well, I think the Democrats have a big problem. I think the White House has a big problem. I think Obama has a big problem because we're now 4 years into a catastrophe for black folk, a catastrophe for middle-class black folk in particular. How did my family get out of poverty into the middle class? First of all, went to college, my father. Second of all, got a public sector job as a principal in a junior high school, and then he bought a house. Well, those three pathways out of poverty into the middle class have become trap doors for black folks out of the middle class into poverty. Our kids who are able to go to college graduate with so much debt and no jobs. The public sector is being decimated, and buying a house now seems like a bad idea rather than a good idea. You got a lot of people with their losing wealth in their homes. These issues have to be spoken to. You have a black middle class that's being demolished, and there is no conversation about that. Now, when black middle class folks don't feel that they have a place to go in Washington, D.C., you know that working and poor and other black folks are going to feel even worse. And so this is something that has to be addressed, that has to be taken on, and I don't want to be in a situation in November where Democrats then turn around and blame black folk for not turning out when for 4 years black folk were given no reason to turn out.
Romney, African Americans, they really haven't made an effort. And not just in terms of putting money in, but just even speaking to those issues. I didn't hear Romney talk about housing at the NAACP. They have not talked about economic empowerment zones and African American women and small businesses. Basically, there's no effort being made by the GOP.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the big issues, you have to ask the question, where are the Jack Kemp Republicans who at least were willing to reach across and talk the language of opportunity and inclusion? Frankly, where are the John McCain Republicans who are at least willing to talk about climate change and environmental issues or any issue that is not just written right off of the page of the Tea Party playbook? There is now no distinction between the Tea Party and the extremes of the Tea Party and Romney. Romney took the Etch-a-Sketch everybody was saying he was going to produce and then come back to the center. He threw the Etch-a-Sketch on the ground and kept marching to the right. And he's marching over the concerns of African Americans. Some of the things that he has done have been incredibly disappointing. How can you have a Mitt Romney talking about birth certificates in August? How can you have a Mitt Romney lying about welfare in August and then want to make the claim that he's a good family man and that he's a good moderate and he has all these different credentials? No, I am very concerned that you have a major presidential figure who sounds like the people who were in the crowds with John McCain screaming about Obama being a terrorist. Now you're starting to have a major presidential candidate that begins to echo some of those themes. That is very dangerous for the country, and I don't think that whatever they do here, until they address that, it's not just bad for black people, it's bad for the country to have a major presidential candidate tailing behind some of these extreme elements in American politics.
Does it, I mean, how bad does it bother you when you don't even hear both candidates even mention poor?
Well,
you talk about middle class,
yeah.
But the reality is there's a lot of working poor out there who are busting their butts trying to get out of it, and they can't even get mentioned.
You got 20 million Americans who were in the middle class who fell out of the middle class in the past 4 to 5 years down into poverty. When you say middle class to them, it's almost like a knife wound because they don't even feel middle class anymore. They remember being middle class and they're not middle class anymore. So when you're talking about issues of poverty, you're talking about both the traditionally poor, whether in Appalachia or whether in the inner city or whether on the Native American reservations, but you also are talking about the newly impoverished all throughout suburbs. You go to the suburbs now, you see these swimming pools infested with mosquitoes. Why? Because nobody lives there. You see grass growing up to the doorknob. Why? Because nobody lives there. And across the street, the people who are still there, they are poor people. So when you talk about the middle-class suburban voter, who are you talking about? You're talking about people, if not them, a close relative, a close friend has fallen into poverty, and yet the word poverty is never discussed. There is a disconnect between what's happening on Main Street and what's happening in these conventions, because the Main Street and the back street and the back roads are living a completely different economic reality that has to be discussed.
All right, man.